But we're not going to do that this week. So if you ever want to join us, that's the first. I'm assuming one day that'll happen again. Here, you can get Jim up here. Thank you. But we do, and that's going to be on Facebook, so it's already going live. All right, my friends, will you pray with me? Oh, gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for your continued presence around us this morning. In our trials, our fumbles, and our falls, we know that you are always with us to uplift and guide us. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each and every heart be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Well, not exactly the way I had intended to start this morning, but a little fumble in the beginning there. But I really want to begin this morning by recounting some of my fondest memories. And some of the fondest memories I have when I was growing up are memories of the church. And memories of my mother in church. And my mom was very focused on her own faith. She was a very spiritual woman, at least while we were growing up. And she was very focused, particularly focused on raising her children, raising my brother and I, with the lessons of Jesus Christ. Now, with that in mind, I spent a lot of time at church every week. I did not grow up in the United Church of Christ, but in a different tradition. I went to church every week for Sunday school, every Sunday morning. And of course, following that, we would have our Sunday worship. Sunday afternoons were usually filled with a social event or some type of educational gathering. And then we'd get a break. And then Sunday evening, we would go back for round 2. Wednesday evenings, we all gathered for worship again. A little less formal, where we didn't have to put on suits and ties. But we still gathered as a community to worship God. And then, of course, Saturdays were completely devoted to youth group time. So we spent a lot of time working with our youth group. So I spent a lot of time growing up in church. But in teaching us the lessons from our Bible and teaching us all this stuff at church, my mother was very deliberate about teaching my brother and I the importance of being at church, being part of a community. But one of the lessons that really sticks with me and has always stuck with me is the lesson that financial giving is an important part of the life of the church, important part of our faith. My mother taught us that we are to put money into the offering plate each week at church. I remember as a little boy when the gold rim plate, very similar to what we have, where the gold rim little plate would be passed around as the deacons were passing those out. Every week my mother would give me a $5 bill. It was my job to put that $5 bill into the plate. And in doing so, she was teaching us that we were giving back some of what we had, some of what we had been given. Now, I don't know about many of you, actually, probably you can relate to me on this, but when I was a little kid, $5 was a lot of money. It just seemed like such an incredible amount of money. So putting money into that $5 whole into the offering plate, sometimes to me, as a child, felt like I was throwing that money away. There were even times that I was tempted to pocket that money, squirrel it away, and not think anyone would notice. When I looked around, there were so many other people in the church who were putting money in the plate. I was thinking, what does the church and God need $5 more from a little kid like me, right? I can keep this. But from a very young age, we were being taught the importance of giving. Not because the church needed it, which of course the church did need it, but because it's one of the spiritual lessons that we are taught. One of the spiritual disciplines that we seek to live out in our lives, in lives that are dedicated to God. As I got a little older, I even began to put some of my own money into the offering plate each week. Some of the money I had received from my weekly allowance. One of the things I never did, though, is I never did pledge at that church. When the annual stewardship campaign came around every year, my parents never filled out a card. They never told the church how much they would be gifting over the course of the year, or how much they hoped to gift over the course of the year. But in the Thompson family, it was always the same. Every single member of our family who showed up, $5 was given to each of them to put into plates each and every week. We were taught that we needed to repay God for our blessings. We were taught that we needed to repay Jesus for his sacrifice. But we were never taught to pledge. Forgive me. So last week we talked about David, King David, and then moving the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. At this point in David's life, things are going really well for him. He's secure in his position as king. The people are respecting his authority as the leader of the people. They're supportive of him. And at this point in his life, he has mostly relied on God's guidance. Mostly. Though we will eventually see a dark turn in David's life where David begins to rely on his own self and his own ambitions. But we'll talk more about that next week. Not quite yet. So at this point in our story, David has established the new capital at Jerusalem. He's brought the ark there. And our story tells us that he's built a fine house for himself. 2 Samuel 7 tells us that he was settled in and that he found rest from all the enemies that surrounded him. So at this point in his life, David has time to reflect. David has time to put his feet up on the couch. Maybe if times have been different, David has time to Netflix and chill. But really, David just has time to relax and realize and reflect on everything that God has done in his life. So in this reflection, David decides it is now time for him to repay God, because God has done so much for David. David feels like he needs to offer something in return. The Ark of the Covenant, of course, as we have talked about, was sacred and central to God's people. They even believed that God resided with the ark. Literally. Since the time of Moses, the ark was housed in a tent. And since they were a tribal migrant society, for generations this had worked well for them. But in establishing the monarchy in Jerusalem, David wants more for the ark than just a simple tent. David is not satisfied with the status quo. David declares to the prophet Nathan that he will build a house for the ark. He will provide a permanent structure for the throne of God. But God rejects this notion. God declares that David will not build a house for God. It will in fact be the other way around. God will build a house for David. God, though, of course, is speaking in metaphor. While David wants to build a literal house for God, God will build a dynasty for David. A lineage that will eventually lead all the way down to Jesus Christ. God says to David that your house and your kingdom shall be made sure before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, theologians disagree on why God would reject this gift from David. Why God did not let David build this house for the ark. Of course, we know this task will eventually be undertaken years later by David's son, King Solomon, when he erects the temple in Jerusalem. But for now, God is having no part of it. Perhaps God did not want David to build a temple because of David's motives. His intentions were good. His heart was in the right place. but he was a little bit off in the way that he was understanding God. The implication of our story is that David felt like he needed to repay God. He felt like he owed something to God. And he does owe something to God. We all do. But what do we owe? In our lives, in 21st century Northeast Ohio and throughout many communities around this world, we feel the need to reciprocate, especially when we are given a very extravagant gift. I know at my home during the Christmas season, I have been known to keep an extra gift or two under the tree should a friend turn up that we had not anticipated, so that we have something to offer. For many of us, when we're invited to a friend's house for dinner, of course, then the proper thing for us to do is to turn around and later to invite them to our house for dinner, to reciprocate. We should repay that kindness. And this is an outstanding gesture. I'm not suggesting that this should change, but we cannot apply these simple human rules to our God. Even as each and every person in this room and this world is created in the image of our God, God is so much more than we. God's ways are not our ways. David's heart was in the right place in wanting to honor God. My mother's heart was in the right place in teaching her children to give financially to the church. But they were both just a little bit off in their understandings and their motivations of why this needs to be done. They thought they should repay God, that they could repay God. Now think about that for just a minute. If we're to actually try to set out to repay our God, what would that look like? How do we offer repayment for being born? How do we offer repayment to Christ for his humiliation, for the evil that was spoken against him, for his torture? How could we possibly offer repayment to Jesus for allowing himself to be nailed to a cross and die a slow, painful death so that we might have eternal life? There is no way we can repay such a thing. But what we can do is honor God in the way that we live our lives. We can honor our God by the way that we treat each other. We can honor our God by financial support of our church. If $5 is a lot of money for you, then give $3. For many of you here this morning, though, I know that $5 is like it was for me as a child. It's throwaway money. We are called to give in proportion to that which we have been given. We don't give in repayment, but we give in recognition of all that God has done in our lives, and in recognition for the support of the ministries in our church. That we can continue to honor God by following the lessons of our faith. I asked earlier, what do we owe? We owe God recognition. We owe our God our respect. I know usually in the life of many churches, and I know in the life of this church last year, to my failure, we tend to confine stewardship conversations to 2 weeks in October. But we can talk about stewardship of our church every day of the year. And in a few months, we will begin our own stewardship campaign. So I encourage us all in the coming months to spend some time in reflection and in prayer about our gifts to the church for the upcoming year, about honoring God, and about offering our recognition to the Almighty for all the gifts that we have been bestowed on in this life, and for all the gifts that our church has received throughout its 160-year history. Now, if you give on a regular basis but have never filled out a pledge card, I encourage you to consider doing so this year. Even if all you are able to offer is $5 each week, there's a spiritual reward of being a faithful contributor to the church budget. And the reality is, without a pledge, We cannot include your contribution into our forecasted budget for the coming year. Now, in my almost year and a half here in Ohio, I have learned that one of the cultural anomalies that's a little different than where I grew up is we don't talk about money, even in church. So forgive me. I will now return to talking about the political crisis in the Middle East. In case you didn't get it, that was a joke. No, but in seriousness, it is my prayer for each of us that we can all give abundantly and proportionally from all that we have, for all the days of our lives, in recognition of God's presence among us. May it be so, my friends. I invite you to the singing of our next hymn. It's in your black hymnal, number 449, Softly and Tenderly. I invite you to rise in body and spirit as you